Welcome to everyone who has been able to join us this morning on the second day of Filecoin Orbit programming. I'm very excited to be able to have an entire session this morning dedicated to discussing Filecoin governance, a process that I am very passionate about and one that really touches all different components of the Filecoin ecosystem. If we haven't had the opportunity to meet one-on-one before, my name is Caitlin, and I'm the technical manager for governance here at the Filecoin Foundation and the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web. And I'm excited to get to use this presentation this morning to specifically talk through not only what governance is at a really high level, but to also walk through what it specifically means in our ecosystem and sort of disaggregate the ways that different stakeholders participate in this process and are also able to participate in future sort of feedback and listening sessions, of which I hope this is just the very first of many that are going to come, especially in the next year or so. This is structured as a town hall, so I do welcome at any point if you have questions, comments, or ideas that you'd like to share with the group. Please feel free to actually unmute yourselves and interject. It's a little difficult for me to see folks who may have raised hands or have added comments in the chat while I'm presenting, so please do not feel shy about interrupting. You're also welcome to wait till the end of this initial presentation, which we're going to use to sort of set some ground rules and some standard terminology for everyone to use. One of the themes of governance oftentimes is that folks really only have experienced it in very specific contexts. And we want to make sure that any kind of conversation that we have as a group or as a community is grounded in some general assumptions that are relatively the same, regardless from the different angles for which we may actually engage with these processes, either in Filecoin or in other ecosystems, DAOs, projects, which we may be involved in, particularly in the Web3 space. One last note, again, that we are recording this session, so if you do not consent to having your name or face shown, please know that we can take that into consideration. And you can let me know privately in a personal chat. And if there are no questions right now, then we can just jump right in. All right, perfect. So let's first start by talking again at that high level about what governance actually is. So whether we're talking about Filecoin specifically or any other project in DeFi or the Web3 landscape, governance is more than just a simple mechanism or tool for making decisions. It is a complex series of processes for sort of aggregating decision-making across a wide array of stakeholders and different folks who may be involved in any particular project or ecosystem. Again, oftentimes what we see is people come to governance with certain prerequisites or assumptions about how things are supposed to operate or how they do operate based on their sort of exposure to the space. And that's really the result of the fact that governance is a really emerging process for a lot of different projects, even more senior or veteran projects that we think of like Ethereum or others. Governance is something that we very actively try and create best practices in, but which many of them are still emerging. And it's for this reason that we're trying to think really big about what governance is currently and also what it can be in the future. And that is partially one of the purposes of the conversation we're having here today. We want to think collaboratively about how we work within governance ecosystems, but also try to think about how different stakeholders in our specific communities may themselves come into this process and how their own work can be empowered through it. So through this presentation, we'll talk a little bit about different mechanisms and modes of governance and also talk about why it's important. But far and away, do know that when we talk about governance at a high level, we are talking about a strategy or a series of processes and not just sort of one single pathway to sort of enacting changes within a particular protocol. And the reason all of this matters is because governance is central to the work of decentralization. What you see on the left of this diagram is what we imagine a very simplistic rendering of the Web2 space, right? So you can imagine if you have friends or colleagues who have served perhaps as project managers or project engineers at places like Amazon or Google. Oftentimes what you'll see is that they work within their direct project team. And even if that team is working on really large scale scopes, they oftentimes have the ability to make decisions directly amongst themselves about what types of product enhancements or features actually get shipped to consumers. And of course, this isn't an entirely closed box, right? Of course, there's customer research, feedback. There are other sort of stakeholders internally at different organizations that have a say in the types of things that get worked on and developed. But far and away, the priorities that these teams set are their own. And what we see as consumers are the end products of these decision-making. We have an effective closed box scenario where we do not have direct say in the types of products that are shipped to us. And oftentimes what this also results in many cases is the fact that consumers don't fully understand the types of products and the full scope of features which may be available to them. In the Web3 space, however, that type of decision-making is spread out amongst a community of users, stakeholders, and direct developers who may have various components and roles to play within a given ecosystem, but which all should, in theory, have equal access to the deliberative space where decisions are made. Now, this is not to necessarily say that all of these stakeholders have perfectly equal say in decisions being made, but it is to say, from our perspective, that different stakeholders, regardless of their different areas of interests or particular areas of expertise, are able to come to the decision-making table in much the same way as one another and share their experiences, preference, and thoughts about decisions as they are made. So within Filecoin specifically, and many other Web3 protocols as well, this takes the form of decision-making about operational goals, right? So how do we think of programs and what types of programs do we want these token funds to be put towards? And it can also be technical tools and enhancements. So if we are looking at a really complicated protocol, how do we make decisions about which features we actually want to see and which ones are priorities for the largest amount of users? Now, as we're going to see, governance is oftentimes a practice of trade-offs, and there is never an easy answer as to which is best, especially since many of the trade-offs we're asked to make are between two very good options. But nevertheless, our goal as stewards of governance in Filecoin or hopefully anywhere else is to help bring people together to make the best decision that they're able to and to move forward as an entire community, shipping products, features, and enhancements that actually respond to the greatest number of needs for the most users that will be actually using this software, these tools, these blockchains, whatever it may be. Which brings us to the actual mechanisms of governance. How do you do this then? How do you take a bunch of stakeholders who may be geographically distributed or have very, very different levels of background information and help them come together to actually make collaborative decisions? This is one of the biggest and most challenging questions for governance, both at a philosophical and a very practical level as well. You'll see we have all of these different diagrams and logos from DAOs that have originated, some of them even in the last year or so, some a little bit more prominent. Bitcoin is still very much considered a DAO. MakerDAO is one of the largest DAO funds that exists today. But it's really important. We have a reason for highlighting DAOs in particular, and it's to say that there is no one-size-fits-all method of governance, right? So if you're thinking of yourself as part of one of these decentralized autonomous organizations, for some people that means any kind of open source protocol like Bitcoin, or even to a certain extent like Filecoin. It can also mean a very specific programmatic use of decentralized decision-making, such as what we see with something like Gitcoin, for example. There are lots of different ways that we can organize ourselves internally and think about relating our decision-making on-chain, using the blockchain, or off-chain, sort of more localized deliberation of decision-making. But it's very important to know that governance, by and away, is a large-scale strategic decision, and it is much more than one specific implementation of a tool or mechanism. So some protocols very successfully use voting mechanisms. Some are simple majority votes where 51% of people say yes and something is implemented. Some are weighted and have different kinds of aggregative methods that make it so that different stakeholders with different backgrounds, different token allocations have more weight than others in actually affirming decisions. And in some networks like Filecoin, we have a more deliberatively oriented process where we do not use voting mechanisms. And this is actually a very deliberate choice. It's important to remember that when you're thinking about what works and what doesn't for an ecosystem, again, it's often about looking at inputs and outputs and not just asking questions about the specific way that decision-making is necessarily prescribed. Again, this is challenging because governance is an emerging area of work. All of us are doing this for the first time, and best practices aren't readily available as widely as they are in certain industries for other types of organizational choices. But for us, it's very important that we do work collaboratively within Web3 and other types of crypto ecosystems to try and figure out what those are and realize that what works for one may not work for others and vice versa. So I do want to pause right now. Are there any questions so far or any ideas that anyone wants to share? All right, great. So let's keep
Yes,
going.
great.
Thank you. Not sure who said it, but I appreciate it. So moving from sort of the high level down to the nitty-gritty a little bit, if we have all of these different ecosystem partners and collaborators, right? Different DAOs, different protocols, different programs that we work with, how do we actually decide then what works and what doesn't? Well, it's about having sort of a nuanced view about the fact that decentralization, right, and decision-making in a community-oriented manner is oftentimes not sort of a binary process. It's not either decentralized or not decentralized, but it's more of a mechanism of moving towards constant decentralized work over time and making sure that as protocols grow and scale, that governance capacities similarly scale alongside them, serving these strategic interests of the broader protocol, but also making sure that decisions that are actually made remain high quality and are actually supportive of the goals of the protocol at a very high level. So what we see oftentimes are when protocols are developing, whether they're newly launched by a team of one or they have been in mainnet availability for several years now, is they slowly move across a continuum towards greater decentralization over time. Of course, there have been accusations of different protocols not sort of attempting decentralization or not doing it quickly enough. But by and away, what we see across the Web3 community in particular is that protocols have made a lot of very concerted efforts to move more and more towards central community decentralization, or what we see on the end is this sort of meta structure, where governance processes exist both on and off chain and reinforce each other in community decision making. Again, this is sort of one way of aligning our expectations and thinking about decision making for those modes and mechanisms that we introduce into particular protocols in which we work. But it's again also a way of reminding us that different teams may be more or less centralized in their decision making, and this doesn't necessarily mean that they are not a decentralized organization. One of the things we discuss in the Filecoin ecosystem all of the time is how do we sort of use our governance processes to actually empower more organic community development of strong sort of developer applications, of different types of tooling features, and of different types of operational standards and metrics. And one of the things that's great is that when we have this sort of larger strategic understanding of what governance is, we're able to think more creatively about the different ways we can actually disaggregate talent within our network in order to achieve that purpose. So again, what you oftentimes see is that with younger protocols, there is sort of a core team that will make decisions or a core community of stakeholders who are very, very involved, either because of interest or because of financial investment. And the goal of any decentralized organization is to develop a governance structure that over time cedes more and more authority to broader and broader numbers of stakeholders in a way that continually allows for innovation to occur and not necessarily in the interests of just pushing out this idea of decentralization without that sort of strategic backbone that aligns with what the protocol is developed to solve. So what does this look like within the Filecoin ecosystem in particular? I wanted to first call attention to the fact that those of you who have joined this call today may experience governance in very different ways within Filecoin. So when we use the term governance, we use it to discuss governance along three key dimensions. The first one is ecosystem governance, which is the work that Protocol Labs and the Filecoin Foundation work together to adhere to. A lot of this is sort of more legal and business operations, standing up project teams, providing resources and allocating capital to very specific and targeted programs, making sure that all sort of necessarily compliance materials are taken care of, et cetera, and also setting growth goals for the scope and scale of the protocol over time. Protocol governance is the work that I specifically do, and this is something that our community is fully open to. This refers to the process by which we actually make changes to the core protocol itself. And again, that can be either technical with enhancements and feature requests, or it can be operational. One recent example was what we refer to as FIP 18, which is the change in terminology, where we now officially refer to our miners as storage providers in reflection of the work that they're actually doing and contributing to the network. That was an operational FIP that went through and was changed. And even though it wasn't technical in nature, we still consider it a component of protocol governance because it changes the logic of how the broader protocol itself functions and is understood by the entire community. And the third component here is programmatic governance, which refers to the individual decision-making processes that happens within very specific programmatic components of this Filecoin ecosystem. Filecoin Plus is a fantastic example. I think several of you who are on the call today are a part of the Filecoin Plus program, either as programmatic officers or as notaries or participants. And within this, it's important to note that, again, these are programs with rules, binding processes, et cetera, but they are also still part of this decentralized and open source ethos, where they have their own internal governance mechanisms, which exist and are open to their own community, but which may be sort of more siloed than entire protocol changes would otherwise be. So now switching over to the Filecoin protocol specifically, how do we make decisions about what types of features or enhancements get added to the core primary code base and developed into the network? Well, there is no single workflow or pathway that works best or encapsulates all experiences. Again, the Filecoin network is a deliberative decision-making body, right? Relatively informal. And we use this for a variety of reasons. It allows us to be very, very flexible. It references the fact that we still have a relatively core group of engineers who work full-time on the Filecoin protocol and contribute a lot of really good ideas and technical specs to the work that is undertaken. And it also reflects the fact that we are a growing network and a growing protocol, and there's a lot of opportunity for different community members who may be coming into the Filecoin ecosystem for the very first time to be able to submit ideas, just like anybody else who has been here since Mainnet Launch perhaps a year ago, right? What we have on this slide, however, is an example workflow of what it may look like to work through the FIP process. And it really sort of charts this movement of an idea for an enhancement all the way through an accepted protocol enhancement status. So what this specifically looks like is an idea will arise. Some of them arise very specifically as concrete proposals for changes that a community member would like to see. Some of them arise very organically as either a really large technical upgrade or a reorientation of systems. We have some ideas that have been around since Mainnet Launch a year ago, which we still think about and which community members still very actively debate, but which are not necessarily ready to move forward into an actual technical proposal for community deliberation. We also have really small ideas that are nevertheless considered central protocol changes. Very recently, for example, we pushed through a FIP that was related to tip set tie breaks, something that has never happened in the network, effectively saying what happens if we have a couple of messages being sent to the blockchain at the same time, and there is a tie in the way that the blockchain tries to prioritize them. How do we weight one over the other in order to make it so that things are as efficient as possible and remain as robust as possible? A relatively small change for a hypothetical that has never yet occurred and is statistically unlikely, but nevertheless helps make sure that the Filecoin protocol remains as robust as it needs to be. Lots of different scales and scope for the various FIPs, but regardless of what the actual proposed change may be, the process is such that when an idea has formulated into a concrete proposal, the author of the idea, whether that be a team or a single individual, will go into the FIPS repo, which is currently hosted on GitHub, and will use a template that we have provided outlining their very specific proposal. I reiterate that this is a specific proposal because it is not enough for community members to propose a general idea for things they'd like to see. This is not necessarily a FIP proposal as much as it is an idea. And one of the changes that we're really working to codify are more spaces for those ideas to be considered by the community and fleshed out with folks with varying levels of expertise and background, so that individuals who may have less technical exposure or may, again, be coming to the network for the first time are still able to propose these ideas without necessarily having to bear the responsibility of carrying them forth into technical development, which is something that, frankly, not everyone is able to do, or folks would even have the time to do, right? So once we have a very specific proposal, there are a variety of security, cryptoeconomic, and technical requirements and thresholds that must be met. These are set by the individual actors who will perform different audits upon the FIP draft itself. So a FIP draft will sit in open issues within our Filecoin FIPS repo for as long as is necessary for the entire draft to be completed. We have different staff members, both at Protocol Labs and at the Filecoin Foundation, who are responsible for signing off on the validity or technical feasibility of the proposal. And it is the Filecoin community at the same time that is responsible for deliberating the actual content of the changes proposed. So oftentimes we will have storage providers who will come out very strongly against or for a certain amendment. We'll have different developer teams that will propose ideas and different developers that may weigh in based on the work that they're also currently doing. It really depends on the very specific issue. And what you'll find is that if you look through the repo at past FIPs that have gone through this process, no single deliberation process is the same. However, once we get to a point where all necessary security, cryptoeconomic, and technical alignments have been made, we understand any backwards compatibility, and we have full specs for technical implementation, the FIP draft itself will move into what we call last call status, which is a final period, usually of 2 weeks, where community members will be flagged for the opportunity to provide any final feedback. This is a really complicated period of time wherein if anyone were to raise a new concern about the validity or proposed metric that's being changed, or if they were to raise sort of a new idea or angle through which to understand this FIP proposal that had not been previously aired or addressed, the FIP will no longer be in last call status, but will revert back to a draft so that that single measure can be taken into consideration and the draft can be amended as necessary. It is important to note, and there has been confusion in the Filecoin community about this previously, something that we're really hoping to continue to work towards clarifying, that disagreeing with the passage of a FIP is not necessarily enough for it not to be accepted. What we need is to aggregate consensus one way or the other. And so even if one person has a very well-formed opinion for or against something, it may not be enough to tip the group. So long as the FIP is technically and securely feasible for the network and an overwhelming number of people do support a FIP, it will move into accepted status for implementation into the protocol. Of course, it is always easy to revert a FIP by launching another FIP, going through this process again. However, it is important to note that we do not have an all or nothing FIP deliberation process. It is a collaborative process, and it's one that we're working towards clarifying as much as possible, while remembering that these kinds of deliberations are always inherently a trade-off. And it can sometimes be really complicated, especially on really complex issues, to actually abrogate and negotiate between all of the competing interests that may come together in the network. Then finally, on the far right, however, what you'll see is we have accepted protocol enhancement, wherein the different implementations will ratify the actual change in different network upgrades on chain. At this point, again, the FIP becomes a permanent part of the Filecoin code base, and reverting that is something which can happen, but only through the passage of a subsequent FIP, which is something that we actually have had happen several times in the past. So a lot of information. I do want to pause. Should anyone have any questions?
Yeah, are there different considerations that you think are more relevant for different crypto ecosystems and different types of DAOs? You mentioned a little bit earlier about Bitcoin and MakerDAO and also the DAOs that have come up this year. So like things that we should be considering and thinking about the governance of each of those.
Sure. Yeah, so one of the things that I think is most important is to consider the scope of the protocol or network and align your governance expectations and potential governance outputs with the scope of the proposed network structure. So what I mean by this is in an ecosystem like Filecoin, we have a very complex protocol. There are a lot of different components that goes into constructing the blockchain. And there are a lot of different layers through which we can understand blockchain operations within this single ecosystem. This is one of the reasons we have a more open and deliberative governance process, is because we can't ensure that something like simple majoritarian voting, which works very well in other ecosystems, would work similarly well for us. It's not something we implemented initially, and we found that this more deliberative approach, being more open-ended and allowing FIPs to sit as drafts for as long as deemed possible before we can put in all of those necessary audits, et cetera, and other considerations, has been something that's been very, very helpful for the network overall. However, for certain DAOs, which tend to be more programmatic or more focused in their function, it could very well be that voting mechanisms are the best way to go forth because they have a really decentralized user base around the world. People may not be working with each other directly. There may not be business interests involved directly, right? It's more individuals participating in passion projects, and they may simply be allocating funding or doing something else that has a very specific endpoint to the actual schematics of what's going on. It's very easy to measure sort of output for that network. One way of sort of disaggregating what your scope looks like and thinking, how do I actually then match my governance capacities to that scope, is to think about what legitimacy looks like within your own network. And this is something that we see a lot of different Web3 organizations beginning to talk about more and more. So if you're thinking about sort of the people who work within a network, the stakeholders that are there, how do you ascertain that a decision that has been made is actually useful, it's productive, but that it is something that the community can accept, right? And this is something that, again, we don't have best practices for determining exactly what this looks like. But for us, what we found is that having a really complex group of stakeholders, a really, really far-reaching group of people who are involved in the Filecoin protocol for a variety of different reasons. For us, ascertaining legitimacy is the result of having a more open-ended process, because every FIP is different. We have different stakeholders engaged in different FIPs, and we want to make sure that regardless of what the actual content of the proposed change is, that different folks are able to come into that network and contribute their own ideas to it.
Caitlin, you have a question from Michael. His hand is raised.
Hey, Michael, how are you?
I'm good. I was going to ask about sort of how you approach handling data relevant to evaluating FIPS. And just for context, it's very common for the stakeholders to bring your own data from their own analysis and sort of present points that are sort of behind really often what they want the group to conclude. Yeah. And I know we've talked about this before, so I won't go into too much detail beyond context for everyone. That has a huge influence on the discourse in an open-ended process. So, how do we manage the data available to form opinions, and how does it play into the discourse around the FIP?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I'm really glad you asked it. When we talk about moving towards decentralization, one of the most important components of that is more information and having that information more readily available to decision makers, right? So when we think about sort of the next year of Filecoin, being able to bring in easy access to metrics, not only so folks can sort of seek them out on their own and view them, but so that teams are able to actually put together these analyses, as you have done in the past, right? And present them to the community one way or another. It's one thing to read through a FIP and say objectively, this is what's being proposed. How do I think about it? And what do I feel, whether it should be implemented or not, based on my own personal perspectives? It's another to look at an analysis that you may not have been able to do yourself and to say, this is sort of an input or an effect that I may not have necessarily anticipated. One of the ways that we would like to try and do this is by opening up more grant opportunities. There are plenty open now, but we have a lot of grantees in the pipeline who are interested in building dashboard-specific programs for different elements of the Filecoin ecosystem. These types of tools make it easy for us to disaggregate this data and present it for relevant FIP contexts. But right now, this is sort of an open-ended question and one that we're looking to work on. So I know you and I have spoken about this very briefly before. I know Barada and I have spoken about this as well. We have begun to see sort of the first trickles of community and ecosystem partners providing these types of analyses. We try and support them internally when we can, especially for very big technical network changes. But it's sort of an evolving process and one that we certainly want to make robust over time.
Thanks.
Anyone else?
Quick question. Can you hear me?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So, so the name of the talk is "Who Gets to Decide?" And in the slide before, there were kind of a couple different stages. And so, in those stages, I think a few things came up. One was if a FIP proposal is technically valid or not, and another is, aggregating and sense making, community sentiment across various channels to determine if there is support for it or not. And so, who gets to decide? Who decides those things? And what does that process look like so that stakeholders can better understand it, understand the process, have transparency into it, then the whole thing becomes more legitimate, yada, yada. So, yeah.
I believe, was that Nelson who asked? Or?
Barada.
Oh, sorry, Barada. Sorry, Nelson's name was highlighted. Yeah, if I had planted a question in the audience, it couldn't have been a better one, right? This is really important, and that's sort of one of the things we wanted to use to spur this community conversation. So for right now, within the Filecoin protocol, who gets to decide? It's an open question, right? We have this deliberative process, and the ideas of the Filecoin community through various deliberative points gets to decide whether or not a FIP gets accepted or not. However, this is not a proactive sense or a proactive process in the sense of, 51% of people have, sort of gauged their agreement with something versus the 49% who did not. It is very much sort of an open-ended process. So for example, FIP 26, which recently was implemented, which changed the fault sector period for storage providers who go offline, for example, from 2 weeks to 6 weeks. This is a very contentious change because it was linked to some real world events that different stakeholders believed perhaps shouldn't be influencing protocol changes. Some believed very much that they should be, right? We had perhaps more community deliberation about this one FIP than any others that I've helped facilitate since joining the team. Things like this can be very complicated, right? Because you have different points of view and all of them are relatively valid. At that point, what we do is we sort of confer this last call status on FIPs once we recognize that they have necessary technical capacities and write-offs that make them legitimate within the network technical scope. And what it really comes down to in cases where there is contention on these types of issues is sort of leading back on sort of the FIP process to sort of deliver an accepted FIP. Should a community member not then raise another issue, which would cause us to stop, pause, and say, this is not something that we can carry forward with, right? So it's not necessarily one person who's deciding, in the sense that we have created this process and this structure, which we're hoping to sort of continue to flesh out. It does currently exist, but there are some points of clarification that do need to be made. It's more of a process of facilitating it through these steps and creating a process that allows the FIP to kind of move without one person saying, now it is accepted or now it is not. If anyone does, we do allow FIP authors to make the decision as to when their FIP should be considered in that last call period, which again is sort of that final point at which any kind of outstanding comments or dissension about the acceptance of a FIP should have already been addressed by the FIP author. And you'll see that core devs also, in improving the technical implementation of the FIP specs, will also ask and ensure that these things have already been completed. But again, it's not as if one person is necessarily deciding, and it's not to say that when sort of this decision is de facto made within this process scope, that necessarily every stakeholder is perfectly contented or perfectly in agreement with the decision that's been made.
So then in there, I think the term we was used a couple of times, but I'm still not exactly sure. So it kind of sounds like there's groups and core devs might look at kind of like the technical side of things. That would be the we in that sense. And then the we as far as like making a final decision, I guess that also goes on the core devs, or like who makes those decisions really? Like, because it can't just be everyone, right? So it's
right. But it's also the case that it's not necessarily one group or person. So the FIP process is specified, right? So that different, perhaps individuals, perhaps groups, depending on who is authoring the FIP, right? And the different scope of feedback and auditing that's required. Different sign-offs will be given at different points in the process. But once sort of the FIP process has been initiated, it sort of carries forth on its own, right? So there is no like single gate of approval that a FIP needs in order to be accepted. There are various components of the FIP that need to be sort of examined, audited, and signed off on, but it is no one person who does this, and it's no one group. So it's not the case that, we have, let's say, 4 FIP drafts that their authors have decided are ready for final consideration. They're in last call status. They have 2 weeks to either be rejected by the community or accepted wholeheartedly. There's no single person, including myself or group, that looks at them and says yes or no, these are accepted or not. And there is no sort of point of formal consensus either within the group. And by group, I mean the entire ecosystem, since anyone is able to participate in the network, correct? It is governance de facto by process, right? So what you have is these different sort of clearances that can be checked, again, by different people responsible for different components, some formal and some informal. And the idea is that, again, actually, it might be important to clarify, many FIPs are relatively non-contentious and relatively small and get very little, if any, feedback whatsoever, right? And I think the process is easiest to understand in the context of such FIPs, right? So, you have an author who drafts something, You have, ZX will do a cryptoeconomic analysis. Different community members will comment or have working groups approving or disapproving of the FIP, et cetera. You'll have core devs who will sign off on the technical specs. You'll have security audits that are independently completed either by the Filecoin Foundation or by auditors at Protocol Labs. If the author decides that these things have been complete, they can check all of the boxes. There's no outstanding comments, concerns, questions. They can trigger it in last call status. And then again, it's that de facto process of if no community member, right, raises these issues, it is de facto accepted after the extension of that period of time, or excuse me, the expiration of that period of time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that makes a little more sense. So essentially, through the process, depending on the type of FIP, multiple things may or may not happen. And generally, as long as there is no large outstanding complaint towards the end part, saying either, hey, this thing was important, it didn't happen, or hey, there's this thing that wasn't considered that should be, yada, yada, then it goes through. So yeah, so essentially it's kind of like a rough consensus type style of governance. Okay, cool. Yeah, that makes more sense.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. And there's two, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I wanted to sort of maybe introduce it's sort of a clarifying question. It's sort of an articulation.
Yeah.
It sounds like you have a distinct roles for people. Anyone may fulfill them, but you have authors, they structure the proposal and it may get de facto passed based on lack of, concern, or it's evaluated and passed, but there's a kind of two other roles that come in naturally here. One is determining what is sufficient for something to be passed, and then the facilitation of the process that sort of determines that those conditions are met. And so they're all governance roles in the sense that you really steer the system by coming in and authoring. You steer the system by deciding what is sufficient for something to be passed, and you steer the system as a facilitator of the process. So there's kind of a meta process that is being poked at by Barada, which is like, okay, but what's the meta process? Because by documenting and explaining that, you give more people the opportunity to participate in the roles, author, the role deciding what it would mean for this to be adequate to be passed, and the role sort of facilitating or sort of making sure those conditions are met, and sort of participating in aggregating the social consensus around it, because those processes are also part of the governance of this process. And so
Sure.
yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm poking at is the first order governance process on the page is really clear. The process of governing that process was sort of vague, and so we're poking at it to try to better understand it.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so this is, 2 points, right? So the one is that we know it's vague. I certainly know it's vague, right? And at this point of improvement, right, at this sort of operational level over FIPS is one of the biggest things that we're trying to work through. So this is actually a great segue into this idea of like constant feedback, of which this is great and very helpful, and also the different opportunities to sort of bring community stakeholders together to actually inform this process, and to say that, this component of this is something we're interested in, it's something we want to be involved in, and it's something we don't presently understand. I think that when the FIPS process was first designed, it mirrored the Ethereum improvement proposal process one-to-one. We borrowed their language thanks to open source standards, right? And it wasn't very clearly defined what that looks like. And as Filecoin has grown and changed, even in the 1 year since mainnet is launched, that sort of stewardship has changed rapidly as well. So this is the first time we've really had sort of stable capacity necessary to really codify that process and actually articulate what those roles look like. So I think in terms of thinking organizationally about those sort of meta decision-making factors, my role primarily is in stewarding information about FIPS and their status, right? So I'm giving this presentation, and it's also why I go to different working group meetings and participate in different kinds of sessions and other kind of like ad hoc community calls and meetings like this. It's why we try and use our Slack channels to share information about FIPS and where they are. We recently created a FIP tracking board, right? But it's also why we're looking to expand the number of community forums we have to codify better documentation and to improve these processes. I think it may have been Barada, sorry, I can't see the names of the speakers, but who called attention earlier to the fact that, you have these like crypto economic elements, right? And you have these security considerations and these technical considerations. But what about additional metrics? Like, where do these come in, and how are we sort of managing capacity for community members to access this additional type of information, right? This is also a component of decision making. It's also something that could be managed sort of as an organizational requirement for the FIPS process at a high level. It's also something we don't support currently, but could in the future, right? So there's a lot of things that are sort of unfolding presently, a lot of clarifying that we want to do. And again, having your feedback, knowing that that process is currently unclear to us, is very helpful. If there's a specific role you'd like me to speak to, I'm happy to, but that's sort of the high level takeaway. We know it's confusing.
Yeah, no worries. It's not even a complaint. It's just participating because
Yeah.
for those of you who don't know, several of us on the call are from the block science team, and we do quite a bit of work evaluating the crypto economic potential design changes. And part of the emphasis I was making about the difference between authoring FIPS and say evaluating them for being sort of safe to deploy comes into our work, where we heavily prefer to focus on the safety and or like feasibility of a process vis-a-vis like whether or not we think it would be okay from a system health and safety perspective, rather than from a particular FIP proposal, specific parameters, trade-offs within the political dimension, like group A prefers A and group B prefers B, but if both A and B are viable, to be able to say so. And so we're learning how to fulfill that function. And as this process matures and is documented better, it would be nice to be able to clarify, like, hey, this is where we fit into that process, versus say, people authoring FIPS are often, at least from what we've seen, a little bit further. Again, community authors are pushing for a particular agenda, and even just teasing out the difference or drawing some even fuzzy lines between those different roles is beneficial for us. And we wanted to participate in the discussion about how this process or meta process works, to be like, part of it.
Yeah, no, it's really helpful. I actually think the point about like who is authoring FIPS is really interesting too, because we've seen that even in the course of the year, right? We've moved from sort of this like core group of engineers who built the network, launched the network, and are now proposing changes for the network. It's still present, but it has moved towards greater community involvement in writing even technical specs for FIPS, right? And one of the things we also want to think about is how do we manage the trade-off there between wanting organic sort of community talent to arise and wanting community members to be able to put forth ideas for protocol enhancement, whether they be technical or not, but also recognizing, right, to the idea that, different people have sort of agendas. It could very well be. It could also very well be that people have sort of some incentive or some sort of siloing within one very particular component of the ecosystem, right? How do you ensure that you are decentralizing the ability for anyone to author a FIP, providing support to this person, right? So someone can have a great idea, but they may not have the ability to write technical specs for the network, depending on the scope of the proposal. How do you gauge at what point there is some sort of coordinated effort to support that construction? And at what point do you say that there is a different space for this person to participate in the FIPS process, right? How do you draw the line, and what actually yields the best overall outcome for the network as a whole? These are still very open-ended questions. They're ones we're working through. But yeah, the need for clarifying and thinking about these things, and also outlining the parameters at which decisions and strategy is affected with this process, is very necessary. And I know we've spoken about this too directly before, but it would be great to have sort of your experiences weigh in on some of the upcoming sort of feedback work we plan to do. So perhaps a great segue, I've listed some of the 3 sort of core events that we hope to schedule before the end of the year, including upcoming governance summit at the end of November, and also launching the first of a series of quarterly governance calls. These will be spaces I hope for really targeted breakdowns of these types of questions, so that we can use this feedback and this buy-in to really drive not only sort of process changes, but process codification as well.
Makes sense to me. I'm not trying to speak too much. I'm excited that we're having this workshop at all because I think it's a good direction for the organization to be focused on.
Thanks. Yeah, I think you guys have raised some really, really good questions too. And it's always exciting for us also when you have people who come and say, hey, we have this invested interest, especially in governance, frankly, and we want to put together materials or we want to be part of this thinking process. Perhaps I'm biased in thinking this since I work on governance all the time, but governance is oftentimes one of those things that touches everything in one way or another, but is sometimes perhaps overlooked or not considered until someone actually needs to use the process. And for when this happens, we obviously want the process to be clear, easy, and accessible. But insofar as we're thinking about it as a core component of how things work in a decentralized ecosystem, we also want it to be something that people actually benefit from participating into, right? So it's great when we have greater buy-in, and I think that's
That actually
hopefully what
begs
we can.
an interesting question though. Like, how do you deal with the action bias? So like this other thing I've noticed in governance, particularly in crypto economic systems, is that participation is important. It's a kind of maintenance that we're observing, we're evaluating, we're discussing, but that tends to lead to people thinking that progress is measured by passing proposals. But in an infrastructure, mostly you don't want to jerk it around. So, in a way, you want to not change stuff unless you really need to. So there's a tension between participation and the notion of we've only done something if we've actually enacted something. And I'm kind of, again, it's open-ended, like I'm not sure how we're going to deal with it, but I do get this sense of like, oh, cool, we're participating in governance, we enacted something. Like, but did you need to? Like, are you sure we should have done that?
Yeah.
Ends up being another kind of how do we think about or contend with action bias in a setting like this.
Yeah, for sure. Also, I feel like we're having a conversation, but anyone else is also welcome to jump in here. So before I respond, perhaps I'll pause.
No, this is a great conversation. I'm loving listening.
Great. Yeah, and again, please, I know it can be awkward on Zoom, but anyone is welcome to jump in here. But no, the action bias problem is really interesting. I think it's one of the reasons that when we've sort of outlined immediate priorities, so thinking of us as any organization really, as capacity constrained, what do we prioritize, what do we do? One of the things that repeatedly surfaces is this need to sort of focus on the beginning of the FIPS process, right? The stage where ideas circulate. Because again, right now we use GitHub, which is fine. We have Slack, we have these working groups, we have community meetings. It can lead to siloing though, and it's not always perfectly clear then across conversation scopes, like how sort of ideas are evolving over time, right? So if you go, and I think actually, Barada, you and I had this conversation, like, yeah, you can go on GitHub and you can see like a string of comments, and there may be 150 of them related to a specific FIP, but it's very hard to gauge whether or not that's actually the full picture. Especially on a forum where it's very easy for people to be anonymous, right? We want to focus on sort of expanding our capacity in this realm because that's where a lot of people participate now. And it's also the space which potentially offers the greatest robustness of participation as the ecosystem grows. So as new community members come in, again, there is this constant hurdle of, how much direct support should we and can we offer to people who have great ideas but don't have the technical know-how to actually write Go code for a Lotus implementation of a large-scale protocol enhancement, right? It doesn't mean that they aren't skilled or they don't have the knowledge to necessarily propose something, but how do you mediate the space where all of these different people with all different levels of background, knowledge and capacity are coming in and trying to, propose ideas which may be really, really helpful for what the network wants to or could achieve. How do you provide space for them? But again, temper that with the idea that, you want the best ideas to surface to the top. And just because an idea is accessible or readily made into a FIP does not necessarily mean, one, it's a priority, or two, that it's the best allocation of resources as extension of being a priority. But also, again, that if you're going to have a network upgrade, you don't necessarily have to pass 10 FIPS just to make it like a quantifiable success, right? Completely agree with you. So yeah, and I guess the other side of the action bias comment too is the fact that if you have sort of resources allocated to providing technical completeness of FIP proposals, You don't want those individuals to presume this role, and intentionally or not, of being the ones who have to weigh in necessarily on the construction of technical proposals, right? So bias towards very select action in components of the FIP writing process, right? If that's clear. So right now, obviously, we have code reviewers, right? Core devs who will go in and have to review and approve any technical specs. But we want these specs to be developed independently too, and we want community members to be able to work on them. And we don't want it to be the case that we provide so many resources that people kind of default to it being done by someone else. I don't think that's necessarily an open source ethos, so to speak. But again, it also sort of insulates your community from true participation. So yeah, lots of sort of ways to think about this problem. But again, for me and the priorities that I've tried to set more broadly, to really focus at the beginning of this process and finding space for sort of holding and sharing ideas in a way that doesn't sort of usher them just towards resulting in a FIP draft right away.
Yeah, at risk of this continuing to be a discussion, I'm going to point out that the second stage, the one after that, is where a lot of our emphasis has been, where at least from a systemic rather than a technical implementation, from a validation maybe rather than a verification standpoint. So for when I say verification, I mean supposing that a technical specification comes to be and it gets implemented, it's a process through which people determine that it was correctly implemented prior to rolling it out. That's verification. Validation is more about the outward looking, like what would the consequences of this change be systemically. And so like our work includes the development of data-driven digital twins and various analytic techniques to understand the potential consequences or to evaluate the observed consequences of changes to the protocol, to the software in general, or our various policies implemented as software. And so, that's one step further down that process, is sort of understanding the consequences, potential consequences or observed consequences of change. And that in turn is something that we want to be able to funnel back into this process of community engagement in a practical and realistic way. And it's still kind of an open question about how that would work. But I'm emphasizing it here because I think it has to dovetail with what you're talking about. Otherwise, like we can't do either well if we don't do them in a synergistic way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think at a really high level, a lot of like the work that happens in governance should have positive feedback loops through every point of the process. And I'm glad you brought this up too, because as we think about some of these other sort of community feedback sessions, we want them to also feed into one another, right? And this is a fantastic way of sort of breaking up thinking and organization of future conversations. So if we were to use this as a model, for example, the idea stage versus FIP drafting versus protocol implementation, right? This latter stage takes care of itself for the most part, but how do we actually disaggregate components of each of these earlier stages? How do we think about, validation, implementation, creation components of them? And how do we sort of benchmark those against one another? That's a great, I think, sort of exercise for thinking about how we plan and talk about this work. But also too, it's great to think that, as we think about this within the context of the FIPS process, right? This should also extend outward into like broader strategic alignments for the protocol and those sort of strategic goals. What do we want to accomplish? Like, do we want the Filecoin network to onboard as much capacity as possible, storage-wise? If so, what types of FIPS should be prioritized? How do we think about that structure as well, versus other competing interests, right? Maybe we want to build up validity and retrieval markets, we want to do other types of things. We want to build the virtual machines that everyone has been talking about for several months now, right? Different ways to sort of build this depth within the FIPS process and extend it outwards as well. And I think that's another framing that will be really helpful and really fruitful for us specifically and our interests, right? But for the broader ecosystem too.
You brought up something that I also think may need attention, which is just the disaggregation of the intent from the process of achieving it. So in this case, I mean, setting, these are the kinds of things we wish to accomplish. These are their relative priorities in a way that's engaged with the community so that the development of even ideas for FIPS go, work against those things, like not against, but like, in the direction of those outcomes.
Can be empowered by.
Yeah, because, one of the issues that we continue to see is a confusion between, the what I'll call the political dimension and the feasibility dimension, which is to say, you might have an idea that says, hey, we're going to try to make this thing better. And then you might have a class of solutions that are a bunch of different algorithms. Maybe we were talking about, for a concrete example, potential incentives or rebates for people who are having to bring down their infrastructure due to migration. And so like, okay, there's a family of solutions, and then there's, very different opinions about, all the way from nothing to, something with this equation. But as you develop families of potential solutions, there's different feasibilities, like, okay, this is the set that could be implemented. And then amongst that family, there's going to be widely varying opinions about like what's appropriate because of who it helps or doesn't help, or under what conditions it's beneficial or perceived as not beneficial to which groups. And that's like a more of a political domain where you could say, look, all of these things make sense, and all of these things would be implementable, and they would have maybe different consequences, but the choice amongst those is a more political choice than it is a technical feasibility choice. And so being able to break down the discussions into, one dimension representing the what I'll call the constraint satisfaction or feasibility version of the problem, all of these things are okay, from selection of a point amongst those things that are okay, and getting different people engaged maybe with different sides of that equation.
Yeah, it's the alignment too, right? At the end of the day, I fully agree with you. And you have to sort of help people see that perspective as well, right? That your preference for certain types of DApp support, right? It's not necessarily a reflection of just your preference, but there are outside and alternatives to consider as well. Yeah. I think we're right at the top of the hour, and I know others may be participating in other programming today as well. Are there any last comments, thoughts, or ideas? All right. So then we can just skip our last open session slide since we dove right into it. Really thank all of you for joining us today, especially to Barada and Michael for helping to really, actually, I think, lead such a really fruitful conversation. As we talked about, there are a couple of upcoming opportunities. So if you are interested in sort of following up or participating in them, keep an eye on the FIPS channel and Phil Lobby in the Filecoin project Slack, where we'll be sharing information about registration and participation, as well as agendas for these things. Otherwise, you're always welcome to reach out to me. I will drop my email and Slack handle in the chat so that you can contact me directly if need be. And otherwise, again, I just want to say thanks to everyone for taking the time this morning to join us, and really for sharing such great ideas and participating in this process.
Thank you. Glad you're at Filecoin Foundation. It's really exciting.
Thanks. Glad we have such good partners, frankly.
Thanks very much.